Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. I hope the birds are singing. I hope the wind is at your back and the sun is shining. We got a great show for you today. The one and only Dr. Ben Malcolm, the spirit pharmacist. I'll give him a bit of an introduction, but I'll kick it to him because what he's doing is fascinating to me, and I think to everyone in the listening audience. He's got his PharmD in PH, founder of Spirit Pharmacist. He offers an incredible library of courses and webinars in psychedelic pharmacology, as well as psychopharmacology, consulting, and education. There's a lot more in there, but let me just dish it off to you right there. How would you, Dr. Ben Malcolm, how would you describe what you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, I come from psychopharmacology consulting and psychedelic education.
Okay.
That's the summary, concise version of like, what do I actually do? I come from a background as a clinical psychiatric pharmacist. So that's how I was trained in a traditional pharmacy setting, some postgraduate residencies in a hospital. I did a year just in psychiatric kinds of settings. I was in academia for almost 5 years, just kind of doing some literature synthesis and talking about psychedelics, giving continuing education talks and things like that. And eventually I just got to a place where I was kind of like, you know what? Academia is cool. I like teaching. I like mentoring students and things like that. But this passion project I've got, Spirit Pharmacist, just seems to be taking more and more of my time. And it's harder and harder to review the applications for new pharmacy school candidates and keep up with all the committee work and things like that. And so the pandemic happened, which I don't know, you might think of as it was kind of a tragic time, to be honest. A lot of people lost their lives, but I also for me personally, it was almost like the great shakeup, where it was just sort of like, okay, anything that you don't like in your life, it is officially time to drop it now. You have a ticket to reinvent yourself, to do anything that you want. The world is closed, and while the world's closed, you get to reinvent yourself and come out of it. When it opens, you can just open in a different way. And so that was essentially the transition year between academia and the psychopharmacology consulting and psychedelic education I do at Spirit Pharmacist now.
It's so well put. And I'm so glad that you see it that way, because it's almost like a shift took place. And there's so many people that I have spoken with that found that time to reimagine who they are and what is possible. And so you talked a little bit about how you moved from the world of academia into the world of being your own person and founding this thing called the Spirit Pharmacist. And you've talked about, you do some education, you do some consulting. Can you give me an example of, let's say that I want to use you, the Spirit Pharmacist, what would I come to you for?
Yeah, so I think the thing that makes me perhaps unique in the world of maybe psychiatry as well as the world of psychedelics is that I kind of come from both sides of things, in that I was interested in psychedelics at the beginning of the day. I was reading about them. I was experientially curious, young in my life, 18, 19 years old. I started reading about them a few years before that even, right? So it's like I actually studied pharmacology and went to pharmacy school based upon an intellectual curiosity in psychoactive drugs or substances. So in some ways, psychedelics inspired me to go on the educational path or direction that I did, right? But at that time, I don't know, I didn't have much vision for my life when I was 19 years old. I was a competitive swimmer. I mean, the only thing you do is follow the black line 40 hours a week and take care of whatever else schoolwork you do on the side, but you're not necessarily thinking about what internship can I have and what do I want to, because swimming is your internship. Lifting weights is your internship, right? There's, I don't know, when you're a Division I athlete, there's not that much space outside of it to do other stuff. So, I never had the vision earlier in life that I was going to be a psychedelic pharmacist per se, but it inspired the educational path. And then as I went through the educational path, I really tried a lot of things. I really did a lot of things. I wore a lot of hats. I tried to do a lot of leadership positions. I sort of felt like, I'm going to drop $250,000 on graduate school. I'm going to get my money's worth. Was sort of my approach to it. It's I'm going to make the most out of it. I'm not going in with any particular conception of what I'm going to do or be at the end of the day. I just know that this is the knowledge I want to soak up and create the most opportunity that I can while I'm there. So that's what I did in pharmacy school. And I'll say it was the postgraduate residency training. This is around 2015, 2016 now. in the hospital, kind of getting burnt out with hospital work, trying to think about like, where do I want to go in my career? And someone, a good friend actually, fortunately just passed away, but she handed me a flyer for a PGY2 or a second-year graduate residency in psychiatric pharmacy. And like holding that flyer, like something like just clicked, like, yeah, like this is the opportunity, like this is what I should do next year. And then when I had that, I was like, well, why are you doing a psychiatric pharmacy residency? And then by then, 2016, hey, Roland Griffiths published the paper on psilocybin and the mystical experience around 2006, 2007. So now we've got several randomized trials, MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, psilocybin for depression, anxiety associated with life-threatening illness, psilocybin for depression had kind of started by then. Ketamine's already a medically approved drug for the treatment of depression or suicidal behaviors associated with depression. So all of a sudden it was just kind of like, man, I got the education, I got the training. This has been my passion and interest from the beginning. And it all just kind of clicked as far as like, yeah, this is the direction I'm going. I'm picking academia. I like teaching. I like students. There's something about like the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed sort of like student that's just coming in like fresh and they're not jaded on the medical system and things like that yet. So they come in with just so much energy and enthusiasm and passion that it's just kind of contagious. And I don't know, I just like students, but I was also kind of like, well, academia, that's the kind of job where you have protected time for scholarship and you're required / supposed to be doing scholarship, like writing academic articles, publishing studies that you've done, or giving continuing education talks and things like that. So I was like, well, and it's academia, you've got academic freedom. So for the first time in my life, right, instead of being a student or a resident where the academic projects are what your preceptor or kind of like superior sort of thinks would be a good idea or a good learning opportunity, it's kind of like, what questions do you want to answer? What do you want to write about? What do you want to speak about? And it was kind of like, psychedelics, man. like I want to write about psychedelics. Yeah. I want to teach about psychedelics. And it's necessary. We have this thing called the Psychedelic Renaissance happening. And to me, it's like, well, I'm an enthusiast. I'm stoked on the Psychedelic Renaissance. But honestly, it's a little cart ahead of the horse in that we've had 50 years of prohibition. We've had 50 years of stigma. We have 50 years of misinformation. Most healthcare providers have outdated and misinformed like attitudes about psychedelics. The public, well, maybe they're enthusiastic on benefits, but don't really know how to create like safe experiences for themselves. And then I think, truly my niche, or like what I do, bridging the worlds, is persons taking psychiatric medications now that are approaching psychedelics for a mental health treatment or an intention for healing. And there's the potential for the kinds of clinically significant interactions that could either take the edge or diminish the effect of psychedelics, so their experience is lackluster and they're concluding it doesn't really work and things like that, perhaps falsely, right? Or they stop their meds too fast, they taper off too fast. There's a level of desperation to get to these experiences, and then they're kind of blown up in withdrawal, coming right into a psychedelic experience. So I'm sort of the person that knows both worlds, that knows the worlds of traditional psychiatric meds, knows the worlds of psychedelics. And basically I'm just trying to take people from A to B, whatever point A and point B is. That's for them to decide, not for me, right? Like my consulting is not inherently about you come to me on an antidepressant and I'm trying to convert you to a psychedelic, right? It's like you're coming to me on an antidepressant and saying stuff like, I've taken this for a long time. I have some level of side effects, or maybe it was efficacious for some period of time and now it's kind of worn off and it's been a while. And I'm really curious about who I kind of am underneath this antidepressant, and if there could be some alternative management strategies, or at least a way for me to have some kind of spiritual experience that allows me to feel more connected. And I think that actually is kind of what's missing from my mental health regimen overall and things like that. So yeah, I'm a psychiatric pharmacist that knows about traditional psychiatric meds and psychedelics. And yeah, that was a long-winded version of psychopharmacology consulting and psychedelic education. Yeah.
It was really well done. I like the idea of being the bridge between this idea of psychiatric medication and psychedelic medication, because it seems we're there right now. You had spoke about Griffith's paper in 2006. And up until that time, it was almost taboo to go down the road of psychedelics and try to get a degree in there. And you were looked at as some sort of woo-woo witch doctor or something like that. But we can see now that there's maybe you could add to your bio like pioneer in a way. Like you are someone who understands like going forward these interactions. You're one of the only people I've spoken to that is really trying to bridge that gap between psychiatric medicine and psychedelic, but how they interact together. What is it doing with this way? What's happening in the brain? And I guess that leads me to the question of, it seems, and I'm a truck driver and a podcaster, so I'm just going to throw this out here and you tell me what you think in your opinion. It seems to me that for a long time, modern Western medicine adopted the approach of the coping strategy where, hey, we're going to give you these SSRIs and it may not solve the problem, but it's going to make you feel good enough to get up and handle your day. You may not go and solve the issues, but you're going to be able to slap on the Band-Aid and get through your day. And it seems like in some of these studies with PTSD, people are taking psilocybin or ketamine or some form of psychedelic and finding a way to face that which has been bothering them. So they're no longer using the coping strategy. They're more using the confronting strategy. Have you seen similar patterns between psychiatric medicine and psychedelic medicine?
Yeah, I think so. Like there's definitely like a flavor of that going on. I tend to not think of it so like black and white or so like extreme. I think that there's still like, there are certain psychiatric medications I'm not a huge fan of and whatnot, but I acknowledge they have a role for some people. They are the right choices for some people, things like that. So I feel like this sort of like, oh, you have depression, you're taking antidepressant. Oh, you're just slapping a Band-Aid on it. Don't you really want to deal with things, right? That there's like this sort of like almost like condescending tone from the psychedelic community that looks down on people that take psychedelic. Like, oh, you're the sheep that bought the big pharma pills. It's like, you got to rip those Band-Aids off if you really want. And it's just, there's just some sort of like sickness to it that is just not appropriate. And it's sort of like anyone that's taking a psychiatric medication, well, maybe 99% of people that are taking a psychiatric medication are taking because they wanted to help themselves and they wanted to get better and they wanted to heal. It's not because they just wanted a Band-Aid to make things go on, right? So all that said, yeah, there's something to it. And it seems that the etiology for so much in the way of, I would say like mental health conditions, but it's also physical health conditions and substance use disorders traces back to trauma or adverse childhood experience. There's something called an ACE score. It's literally the number of traumatic events you had between age 0 and 18. And it strongly predicts your propensity to have mental illness, physical illness, or substance use disorders in your adult life, right? So trauma, that's a big one as far as like a root cause etiology, but I also think like chronic stress as an adult is like another one. So I think that these two sorts of like factors, like I have a daughter, right? She's beautiful. She's gonna be
congratulations
this weekend.
Yeah.
But she has like Play-Doh, right? And you take the Play-Doh and you put it through these different filters, and some of it like it makes spaghetti and some of it makes stars and this and that. So I'm sort of thinking like, well, these filters in the Play-Doh, it's like your genetic predisposition. And the Play-Doh, that's the trauma, that's the chronic stress. And you push trauma or chronic stress through a genetic predisposition and it will express some kind of illness. But whether that illness is a spaghetti illness, a star illness, things like that, it's, that depends upon some of the person's kind of makeup overall. So there's something about psychedelics that do give access to, I would say, like a deeper level of self, like a traumatic self, like The Body Keeps the Score is a very popular book that describes trauma theory around how traumatic events are stored in our subconscious or even unconscious, kind of like our peripheral sort of nervous system. And there's a big sort of somatic component a lot of the times to what I would say like cathartic release that occurs at the peak of psychedelic experiences. So it may be fair to say that psychedelics have the ability to get closer to the etiologic root of illness and maybe able to affect the etiologic root of illness, perhaps more so than traditional psychiatric medications. But, on the flip side, there are people that take psychedelics and don't really confront and work through different kinds of stuff. And there's some, like look at ketamine. I mean, ketamine's approved as an antidepressant, but 0 clinical studies that were done with ketamine were done as ketamine-assisted therapy so far. So what you're looking at there is just a raw, naked, neurochemical antidepressant benefit of ketamine. And it seems to, on average, you give 1 infusion, it lasts 3 to 7 days, right? So there are ways of essentially symptom managing using psychedelics, right? There's also the person that is really feeling down and really feeling bad and can't get out of bed and takes an antidepressant. And then they get out of bed and they go to the gym and they go to a nutrition and they go to therapy and they heal because they're getting to the root of their things. They're changing their lifestyle so that that chronic stress is being toned down. It's being removed. Stop pushing the Play-Doh through the filter. You're going to get less symptoms and you're getting close to solving the etiology of your illness. So yes, right. Like, yes, there is something about psychedelics that I think does get closer to the heart. There's something about the mystical experience, the experiences psychedelic gives that's highly personally significant and meaningful. There's data with MDMA showing that it sort of reopens what they call like neurocritical periods or periods younger in life where our brain was plastic and developing in a different way, which really does seem to give us the opportunity for unlearning and relearning, which is, maybe the literacy of the 21st century in some ways, right? So yes, psychedelics have that kind of flavor, but I'm a little bit reserved to just be like, psychiatric meds, those are Band-Aids, psychedelic drugs. Oh yeah, now we're getting to the root of illness and just, plucking it like a weed from the garden and you're fixed, because that is...
right.
There's a flavor of truth in there, but it's not all of it.
Yeah, it's a great point. I guess it kind of shines a light on how many moving parts there are and how narrow that point of view is. Even like I've taken that view for a while, but the more that I think about it, like I don't know everybody that has psychiatric problems. I can only compare things to my life or people that I know. And even the people I know, is probably not a fair, accurate judgment of what they're going through. You brought up something that I'm fascinated by, and it's the interactions between different drugs. I saw recently that you did an article between ayahuasca and albuterol. I'm a big fan of psilocybin and human growth hormone, but I'm wondering, like, what are in your article that maybe you can talk a little bit about, is if you would like to, is the ayahuasca and albuterol. You have like a steroid, and then I was wondering if maybe you could kind of freestyle on the idea of psychedelics and human growth hormone. Or is that not something we should do on is that okay to do it?
I don't know if I have much like freestyle input on human growth hormone and psychedelics, but the kind of I don't know, what was the first part now? You shocked me so much with the human growth hormone question that I forgot the first part.
All I have on the human growth hormone and
ayahuasca and albuterol. That was the first part.
There you go.
Yeah, so ayahuasca is unique as a psychedelic or a psychedelic sacrament because it contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And monoamine oxidase inhibitors aren't psychedelic in themselves, but they block the metabolism of certain neurotransmitters, which creates a metabolic vulnerability. Right? You can take certain drugs, and with this metabolic vulnerability, you can run into really serious adverse effects, things like hypertensive crisis, which puts persons at risk for essentially having things like hemorrhagic strokes, like blood pressure so high that like vessels in their brain kind of like burst or start bleeding. Bad. Don't want that to happen. Or serotonin toxicity, which is much more about serotonergic drugs with the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And that's more like extreme hyperthermia, myoclonic seizures, confusion, agitation, comatose, going to the ICU, getting a breathing tube placed, things like that. So both of those things are things that you would really want to avoid and not do, right? And so you can find, because monoamine oxidase inhibitors were the first antidepressants that really ever came to the market in the maybe even late 50s or 60s. And at that time, the asthma inhalers that they were using were benzodrine inhalers, aka amphetamine inhalers. So, if you had asthma back in the day, you got an amphetamine inhaler to dilate the bronchioles or the airways. Since then, we've had this sort of genesis around bronchodilatory drugs, and we have albuterol, which is a short-acting beta agonist. So it's a rescue medication. It's meant to open the airways in the case of a allergic or an asthmatic kind of attack that's closing off the airways. So you can find all of these warnings online, like don't mix monoamine oxidase inhibitors with, inhalers, because I don't know, it never really says exactly what's going to happen, but it just says don't do it. It's contraindicated, things like that. So you can find these sorts of things over the internet. And oftentimes I'll find ayahuasca retreats with just laundry lists of drugs that persons aren't allowed to be on or aren't allowed to bring to ceremony and things like that. And some of them are true, but a lot of them I find I'm just kind of like, I'm scratching my head thinking, I'm not really sure why that would be a problem or why a person couldn't use that. And for the most case, I don't write any articles about that. Yeah. But with albuterol, I was kind of thinking, well, geez, if someone's airway is closing in a ceremony, I would want to use something that opens their airway. And I would be willing to take the risk of a pounding heart, some extra hypertension, if someone's airway was really closing, because that could be life-threatening if they were severely asthmatic. And ceremonies, the kind of place where people are smoking mapacho pipes and burning all sorts of incenses and things like that. So there could be allergic triggers around or kind of in the atmosphere. So I'm kind of thinking like, yeah, like, should you just load up an albuterol for fun before you drink ayahuasca? Like, no, that's not what we're talking about. But the decision to use a drug is always a risk versus benefit kind of decision. Right. And if you're kind of thinking that probably a lot of these warnings about MAOIs and inhalers came from the time when people were literally like inhaling amphetamine, which would be dangerous with MAOIs, versus albuterol works on beta receptors, doesn't increase serotonin, norepinephrine, or dopamine, doesn't block the reuptake of those things. There's very little pharmacologic premise to believe that it would be dangerous with MAOIs. I can find textbooks of emergency medicine that basically say if someone's on MAOIs and their throat's closed, use an albuterol inhaler. You could even give an EpiPen if it was anaphylaxis and life-threatening. And an EpiPen with MAOIs, that would be a risk versus benefit decision. But I can find, textbooks of emergency medicine that's basically saying, like, if it's an emergency, do it. Manage the consequences of the interaction afterwards. But if it's an emergency and the throat's closed, you just got to act. Right. So I picked that one to write an article about because I felt like it was one of these rules around ayahuasca that's not really grounded or evidence-based and could be the difference between, someone having their airway open and not. So I just felt like that one was a really important one to kind of like outline that, no, if you got asthma and there's a risk of your airway closing, bring your rescue inhaler to ceremony. And, if it's really, let's say like a severe asthma attack, like wheezing and shortness of breath, like there's like, the facilitator would be able to like hear the sort of like breathing difficulty, then you could administer it. I think the flip side of that is like, okay, maybe someone had childhood asthma and maybe there were a few times they had some pretty bad attacks as a child and they couldn't breathe and that was just traumatic for them. And they're an adult now and they haven't used their asthma inhaler in years and it's like, okay, well, you've still got it. It's not expired. Okay, bring it to ceremony, right, in case of emergency. But I think that there's an opportunity or a chance, I guess, that sort of like the trauma of the past comes up. Like I'm having a panic attack and I'm like, I can't breathe. But it's like, well, I can hear the airway open. It's just very rapid, shallow. It seems more panicky. So let's give you some emotional support, try to deepen the breathing, try to get you tuned back into the music perhaps or following the song. And, I'm going to stay with you and, until the panic has subsided, or I'm really hearing the shortness of breath or wheezing that would indicate like, wow, there's really something going on with your airway. And I'm going to help you with that now.
I bet you could just give someone like a blank thing, and would probably help them, because sometimes it's just the idea of having something that's going to fix you, right? Like the whole placebo idea of like, use this inhaler. Okay, perfect. Oh, you're way better now. You know what I mean? On some level,
possibly. Like, I mean, if it was like truly like panic, right? It's probably like the asthma inhaler, it forces them to be like, right?
Oh,
So
my
it's like
mom,
just the inhaler in itself
Yeah,
would like
yeah,
force
exactly.
a person to try to take a longer, slower, deeper breath, or
Right.
you know,
It's interesting to think about. You know, we hear a lot of different talks about different kinds of psychedelics, and I saw a little blurb that you did on MDMA and is it a psychedelic? I was wondering if you could share that story with people.
Yeah, so psychedelic means mind manifesting, right? And so there's I think that there's a lot of cool words out there in the
Yeah.
world of psychedelics, right? So like originally, originally to the West, let's just say that, right? Not originally, but originally to the
Right.
West. Psychedelics were termed psychotomimetics, meaning they mimic the state of psychosis. So the first words that we had that described the effects of psychedelics literally had nothing to do with what the person was feeling or experiencing, and it was what an observer thought of what they were feeling or experiencing. Well, they look psychotic, they ate LSD or something like that, right? And then the term sort of like hallucinogen, meaning to generate hallucinations, came along, and I don't know, perceptual distortions, profound perceptual distortions sometimes. I don't know, hallucinations maybe like I guess I think of hallucination more like there's a leprechaun in the corner, right?
Totally.
Whereas like I think of more like, whoa, the tapestry is changing colors and shifting into
Yep.
these fractal patterns, and it sort of looks like the wall's breathing a little bit.
Yep.
I'm like, well, to me that's a little bit more perceptual distortion.
Right.
That hey, you want to call it hallucination, like that's fair enough. Like I'm not going to argue too much. Psychedelic is probably like the best term because it's just a generic umbrella term that means mind manifesting. And so I don't know, like MDMA definitely shows you something about your mind and how your mind works, and you can gain insight from those experiences and things. So from that kind of like angle, yeah, it fits the bill, psychedelic. And I would add, like, from that angle, the dissociative anesthetic ketamine fits the bill, psychedelic, right? But many people will be like, that's a dissociative, that's not a psychedelic. And it's like, well, if it's revealing something about my mind that I'm learning from, then that seems mind manifesting enough to me. But MDMA is probably like more accurately thought of as an enactogen or empathogen, meaning to generate a state of empathy. That's like empathogen, to feel empathy to another or oneself, right? A lot of self-empathy with MDMA, a lot of like self-love. And that's what enactogen means, to touch within, right? So when people say the word psychedelic, they are usually talking more about what they call like classic psychedelics or maybe classic hallucinogens. These are things like psilocybin, LSD, and N-dimethyltryptamine or just DMT. And the kind of oddball phenethylamine there is mescaline. But MDMA is more like a designer amphetamine that happens to be serotonergic. So it's a serotonergic amphetamine. It doesn't really cause very much in the way of perceptual distortion. It doesn't really cause much in the way of like mystical experience, or this kind of, like I would say, like non-dual experience where the person feels sort of merged with ultimate reality or God or kind of whatever their faith predisposition is. It's much more of a self-knowledge drug. It's a fear-reducing type of drug, right? So people sometimes will colloquially refer to MDMA as a heart opener. I'm kind of thinking heart opener might be synonymous with fear reducer, in that if you reduce a person's fear, then all of a sudden they're open, right? It's sort of like a person's fearful. What do? You crouch down, you curl up, you protect your heart, right? So a heart opening effect could almost be synonymous with a fear reducing effect in some way. But I guess I like the heart opener because I think that where MDMA is squarely a psychedelic is your emotional range. Like it opens your emotional range. And so you've got reduction of fear, an open emotional range, and an ability to kind of connect with yourself. And that's probably why it's a good place to start for somebody with severe PTSD, because it's not so much dissolving them out there in the universe. I mean, psilocybin, when it's good, oh boy, it's spiritually ecstatic, but it can also be dysphoric and just like kind of rake you through the coals and take you to an underworld. Whereas MDMA, I mean, they call it ecstasy and not agony on the street for a reason. There's a neurochemical buoyancy to it. right? There's sort of an ability to look at really difficult things that have happened and process them in a way that doesn't overwhelm you with fear. Not that psilocybin couldn't be a helpful tool for PTSD, but I tend to think when the PTSD is severe, they kind of go to a place where they dissociate a lot, things like that. And then I'm sort of thinking, yeah, MDMA might be a softer place to begin and start sort of exploring that kind of territory. So MDMA is squarely not a hallucinogen. And most people, when they say psychedelic, are talking about classical psychedelics or hallucinogen types of psychedelics. But if you want to just call it mind manifesting, an emotional psychedelic, an enactogen and pathogen, like all of those things, like I'm not going to like argue with you about them. It's like I've seen a few people on MDMA their first time, they take it, like it's an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours into it. So it's at the peak and they look at you and I mean, their eyes are as big as saucers. So it's like, okay, like, you know, it's on. And they'll say something like, oh, I expected to feel like I was like intoxicated or on drugs, but I just feel more like myself than I've ever felt. And you're like, yeah, because it's probably you without fear, without the avoidance mechanisms, without the things that squash your highest self, essentially. And so a lot of MDMA is removing these filters of judgment and fear and kind of seeing who would I be without those layers. And I mean, of course, fear and judgment are going to come back in. It's not like MDMA just bludgeons a fear response out of a human being permanently or something like that. You know, it's like, no, you know, like fear is a very useful and adaptive part of our biology. It can get out of hand and run rampant. Yeah, true. But, you know, the fear response, I mean, we'd all be dead if we didn't have a fear response.
Yeah.
Like straight up. So yeah, that's kind of why I think MDMA could be termed a psychedelic, but in some ways maybe doesn't fit as well as other things, or at least doesn't necessarily fit with what persons typically are conceptualizing when they say the word psychedelic. Yeah.
I'm curious. It seems that from what I've read and it seems that MDMA is releasing serotonin. Is it also releasing oxytocin as well? Is that kind of what gives people that closeness and the want for relationships? It seems like maybe there's not as much of that love, and I'm just assuming that's oxytocin that drops that in when you don't really have that on psilocybin or LSD.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely like a neurohormonal releasing effect of MDMA that has not been documented with some of the other like classic psychedelics like psilocybin. And it is an oxytocin release. Like that's one neuropeptide that's released, but it also releases antidiuretic hormone or arginine vasopressin. That one perhaps plays a little bit more role in, I would say, like rare kinds of toxicities. Like you can get low sodiums or a condition called SIADH sometimes from taking MDMA and probably drinking too much water at the same time. But yeah, the oxytocin part of MDMA, yeah, it's hypothetical. Like it's hypothetical as far as like what part of the MDMA experience is from oxytocin, what part is from, because I mean, it releases serotonin, also releases norepinephrine and dopamine. You know, those are kind of feel good neurotransmitters and things of that nature. So I believe that, you know, I don't want to say it and get it wrong, but I've read an article or two out there that kind of, I would say, is a little bit skeptical towards like how much of the MDMA experience is responsible for oxytocin. And honestly, I don't recall the details of the experiments at the moment. But yeah, basically I've read a few articles that kind of have a narrative around, well, MDMA does do that. It's widely thought that is why it has this kind of like social bonding and pathogenic type of effect, but there's really not very much that clearly shows that or demonstrates that, and maybe even some probably more like preclinical stuff in rodents or animals demonstrating that the oxytocin effect may not be so huge. But I don't know. I mean, like I remember when I had my kid, right? Like I remember like holding her as a baby, and it's like I felt like I was high on MDMA just holding her as a baby, and it was just kind of like, Yeah, I don't know if this kid just like causes my brain to like rain neurotransmitters, or whether it's just releasing so much oxytocin, but like there was sort of you know, a subtle self-proof or something around that experience. It was like, whoa, like now I appreciate the neurohormonal aspects of MDMA without the sort of like stimulant amphetamine part of it, because, you know, just holding a kid, I'm not on amphetamines. Yeah.
Yeah, so that makes me think of, you know, let's talk about the idea of having a kid again. And sometimes we remember, and I guess this question is basically going to be about how the brain works. And this is all hypothetical because I don't know. I'm just asking you. And so
Yeah, I don't know either.
so we'll just give our opinions here, or at least I'll throw out mine and you can bounce it back to me.
Yeah.
You know, when I have a kid and I remember holding my kid and I remember teaching her how to ride a bike, and like I remember these really emotionally charged moments of when things happen. And I'm in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, that must have been when the neurotransmitters were really pumping through the system, or, you know, that's when some new neuroplasticity was taking place. And then if I can look at like a psychedelic experience that I've had, and, you know, let's say before I go into a high dose psilocybin experience, I sit down with my journal and I think about my intention and what it is I want to think about, or what it is about me that I want to figure out, or my relationships. I've found that, you know, that at that state, while I may not remember exactly what happened in that state, it's the time after, the integration afterwards. But after about a month or so, I feel as if I really learned something in that state. And I think it's similar in that. Is it possible that what you're seeing is this mega release of hormones, or you know, different neurotransmitters that are allowing you to learn something more deeply and more rapidly? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think like for example, gosh, it's like, oh, what's his name? Like, I forget the names, but they wrote in this book about consciousness. Maybe like Jamie Wheeler. It's like
I think
one of the authors. There's two authors to the book. They have a beautiful book about consciousness, and they talk a lot about flow. They talk about flow states, and basically how research demonstrates that if you can get into flow, then neuroplasticity, creativity, things like that just sort of like naturally increase. And, you know, in that book, they actually talk about surf therapy for PTSD, and talking about how, you know, they took this group of persons and taught them how to surf, because surfing is something that just induces flow. Like there's certain activities or things that you can do that just kind of induces flow. And we've all sort of accessed a flow state at one time or point. It's kind of like you're doing something and then you just sort of forget about everything else. Some people call it the zone, like you're in the zone, right? The person that's climbing up that rock face that's God knows how many thousand feet tall or something, and everyone's like, aren't you scared you're going to die? And it's like, well, if I got scared, I would fall. I have to stay in the zone. Like I have to be in flow. That's the only way that I could do this. If I started thinking about what happens if, you know, then it would all fall apart, right? So there's definitely places that we can go in our mind where our brain's capacity to do certain things is greatly expanded or enhanced. You know, there's, like, as far as I'm concerned, that's like an empirical sort of truth rather than a hypothesis. But yeah, like, I don't know. I mean, psychedelics can be peak experiences. Like there's certain things that we conceive of as peak, like the birth of your kid, probably like a peak sort of experiences. Near-death moments, maybe also peak sorts of experiences. You know, people are sort of drawing these parallels, right, between the types of lessons that persons get from near-death experiences. I'm never taking my life for granted again. I'm never wasting another day again. I'm never leaving my loved ones and not saying I love you again, because it might be the last time. And I would never want to leave it hanging that way ever. So I'm not going to do that anymore. Like I can't take life for granted. I think that's one you know, thing that happens with psychedelics is it changes persons' relationships to death and to life, really. Because I mean, changing relationship to death is changing your relationship to life. and that, the person that's sort of obsessed with death is the person that is not choosing life, right? There's sort of like this ambivalence between life and death, and sort of like, okay, you have an experience where you realize whatever you want about death that puts it in its place, and then all of a sudden it's like, right, this life is so precious. I'm in the now. I have to focus and do what I'm doing now. I think having a kid, I mean, wow, it's like one of the most psychedelic things ever, to be honest, because it's like the wheel has like rotated like one like full direction, and it's like you teaching your kid how to ride a bike, but there's part of you that's remembering how you were taught to ride a bike at the same kind of time. Or you tend to want to watch the same movies you watched when you're a kid. The Land Before Time, that was a good one. You got to rent it, that kind of like stuff. So you get a chance to sort of like do it over again. And I think that for a lot of people, it's one of these experiences where it shows them exactly kind of like where the trauma is, because they see their reactions to the kid's behavior and they see themselves, whoa, I was about to enact the exact thing that I hated being done to me. Like that sort of thing. So I don't know if that really like answered your question around like the neuroplasticity of like teaching a kid to ride a bike, but there's certainly some like really deep moments from when you're raising a kid, and whether it's because the wheel has turned and it's sort of like, wow, it's like you're experiencing the life of two persons almost like simultaneously, or something else. But I would say like in my consults, right, there's a few sort of like phases to life. And I'll say like maybe the older adult around like retirement age, or an age where perhaps like there's a little bit more like loss and illness around you and things like that. Like that's a pretty common time to want to sort of like reevaluate things when you're kind of considering what does the next sort of like chapter look like. Like that's like a pretty common like flavor of consult. I would say like 50 to 70, somewhere in there. But I would say the other really common flavor is the 30 to 40-year-old that either is expecting a family or has a new family, and it's just sort of like brings all the shit up. And they're like, I want to deal with this now because I don't want to pass it on. And it's a good time. Like it's a good time to do that kind of work. And you can, that like your kid can be your healing muse. It's like I was reading something that it actually kind of teared me up the other week. And I can't remember exactly where I was reading it, but it basically said something like, well, a lot of parents, like if you ask them, they would, would you die for your kid? Oh yeah. Would you truly live? Would you give up all your bad habits and be your best person for your kid? Shit, that's hard. So I think in a lot of ways, like, of course you love them. I would give my life for them. Right. But like probably the best gifts that you can give them is to work on yourself, because, that's going to be better than sacrificing yourself for them ultimately. Yeah.
It's kind of a paradox too, because
it's a paradox. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. If you're part of you has to die if you want to be the best parent you can. Like all those bad habits, if you want to be the best parent you can, then part of you has to die. Like this part of you that lived alone, this part of you that didn't understand relationships, this part of you that's still your dad that hated these things. Like it has to die. And if you raised your hand, you're like, I'll die. Well, then which part of you is lying? And that brings us to this idea of, I love the idea about the wheel and I'm a big fan of like this third way, I call it. And it's sometimes at the peak of a psychedelic experience, you get to see yourself as the subject, the object, and the observer. And if you've been in this position where you just pan back and time kind of changes a little bit, and you're like, wow, I can almost see all these decisions that I made, or I could see how they would have gone. Not that it really would have gone that way, but it gives you a different perspective. And for you to be able to see your life as an observer really just gives you a very clean perspective on what you can do to change your life. And I'm wondering if you've heard about some of this in some of your consulting. The subject-object relationship we talk about all day long. We're having a subject-object dialogue. We look at things like objects. But this idea of the observer is something that's kind of brought about in the psychedelic experience. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
What do you think about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I think it's I kind of use this like as far as like, well, why would I take a psychedelic? Like, what would be the point? And it's like, well, different perspective. You gain some perspective, right? It's like, well, like, oh, maybe you will feel better. Maybe you'll get a rapid reduction in your symptoms. Maybe you'll have a mystical experience, right? Like those kinds of things. But it's sort of like, at a very basic level, I mean, you should be able to learn something from almost every experience in life. And that's a good way to approach life, is that, everything that happens to me is a learning experience. And I feel that the psychedelic experience is, I don't know, it's mind manifesting. It's like that on steroids or something. It's like an exponential example of something that is just constantly true, like overall. Gosh, I derail myself.
It's fascinating to me. I if I take it back for just 1 minute, earlier in the conversation.
Oh yeah, the subject object. Yeah, yes. That was it. That was it. Yeah, I got it now.
Okay.
Right. So like, it's like someone that's never taken a psych. Like, why would they take a psychedelic? It's kind of like, I don't know. Like, let's say you put together a 10-year plan for your life, right? And you've got it dialed in, or you think you've got it dialed in, or maybe it's a business plan, right?
Better,
right?
Yeah.
Better example, like a business plan, right? And you're kind of like ready to go with your business plan, and someone says like, hey, maybe you would like to get a fresh set of eyes to read your plan to see if there's anything that might need altered or changed, or no one would respond like, oh no, a fresh perspective wouldn't be good for my business plan. Like, and it's true, I guess you could hire a business consultant that gives you a bunch of really terrible advice, and you implement that advice and it screws it all up. Like, look, okay, that's possible, right? Set and setting. Don't hire the wrong business consultant, right? That's the parallel there, I think. But you kind of see what I'm saying. It's sort of like, all right, if you are able to dissociate from this relative subjective perspective and expand a little bit and kind of see things from a more neutral and bird's eye perspective, it's wildly helpful.
Yeah.
And I think, like, honestly, like a lot of psychedelics do this. I mean, I think, it's like, is it this like perfect, clear perspective observer? And it's like, I don't know, it's a little bit of a funhouse mirror, the psychedelics. Like, there's a bit of like, there's still a little bit of distortion there that, you got to check yourself in the process. But I actually think ketamine might be one of the best drugs for this kind of thing, because it is a dissociative. Like, it kind of dissociates the consciousness and causes it to bubble up, and it really does feel a lot like an observer perspective. At least to me personally. It's like interesting in that way, is that dissociate actually has a negative connotation in society, and even further so in psychiatry. It's like literally symptomatic jargon associated with trauma responses. Right. Like fight, freeze, or dissociate. So I've had some people like, be like, ketamine just causes dissociation, so obviously it would worsen PTSD. It's like, no, I don't think you're just. I think that these are different sorts of dissociation that you're speaking about here, and like, maybe you need to disassociate so that you can reassociate in a way that you would like, right? Or maybe people talk about psychedelics as being destabilizing. It's like, well, it's probably true. I mean, they've definitely destabilized my life a few times, and I've had to go through some pretty massive change processes and whatnot. But I'm appreciative and grateful for the destabilizing effect they had, because I was stabilized in a place I didn't want to be. Right? So if it's kind of like, if you're going through life, maybe you're on a psychiatric medication, maybe you're not, everything's stable, and you love it, I'm not sure if you should use a psychedelic, right? But if you're going through life and you're kind of plodding along and it's feeling like monotony, and I don't think I'm going where I need to go, and this is kind of blah and gray, and maybe you're just stabilized in a place that isn't for you, and maybe it's going to require being a little off balance for a moment to recenter in a way that now I'm standing straight up and down because of enactogens.
Yeah, it's a great point. It brings up In some ways, to me, it brings up the merging of science and spirituality. And I'll give you an example. When you look at like Schrodinger's cat, right? Like they're like, is it a wave or is it a
Yeah.
particle? Well, it's the observer. It's the observer who plays, I don't know how, but the observer plays a fact in there. And the
Yeah.
same thing with spirituality is like, okay, am I what's going on in my life? Well, how are you looking at it? You're the observer. And just being aware that you're the observer has a radical effect on your life. Like if that's something that if people could take away something from some of my podcasts, that would be it. It would be aware that you're the observer and watch how much that changes your life, because it can have a radical effect on your relationships. It can have a radical effect on your language. It can have a radical effect on how you see yourself. And I just think this maybe that's the foundation, or maybe that's a bridge between science and spirituality, is this idea of awareness. You had brought up these interesting words like mind manifestation and self-love. And when we think about the science of psychiatrics, isn't it weird how similar it is to spirituality, or maybe a lack thereof? What do you think is the relationship between those two things, spirituality and psychiatric medicine, or psychology and spirituality? Well, what's the relationship there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems pretty clear that there's never going to be a comprehensive understanding of us, the universe, without a map of consciousness, without a science of consciousness, without a study of consciousness, right? So, yeah, traditionally, science and spirituality have been these like oil and water things or something, where it's like people can't quite put them together in some ways. But I think a lot of scientists, honestly, you just go like deeper and deeper into it. Probably the astrophysicist knows it the best, right? It's kind of like you just go to the bottom, and in the bottom, there's just kind of God like staring at you, and you're sort of like, yeah. It's like this mystery is really deep, is really the kind of conclusion. So, yeah, mystic. Basically, I think that you're right. Is like switching, like at least being able to toggle between subjective and an observer perspective, right? So you could sort of like, oh, Ben is angry now, right? Like, okay, just observing that I'm angry now. It's like, are you going to go observe Ben making a bunch of bad decisions in response to that anger, or can you just acknowledge that Ben's angry and accept that he's angry and go choose some kind of behavior that allows you to not spread anger, put it on somebody else, project it, like whatever the sort of standard psychological strategy is going to be to manage yourself. And you'll notice different things about yourself if you can really take the kind of like a observer route. And yeah, I think that's like, I mean, that's a lot of what I think meditation is focused on, is like cultivating the witness, or having this sort of like observer perspective to your life. So like science is, I mean, that's kind of spirit pharmacist, right? I was sort of like, well, that's what's missing. That's what's missing from pharmacy, is the spirit. Like there's no, it's like, oh, I got high blood pressure. All right, take an antihypertensive, physiological, make your blood pressure go down. It's like, well, it's like I'm having trouble focusing. It's like, well, here's some Adderall, like an amphetamine to like boost your cognitive function.
Totally.
Right. And oh man, it's like the anxiety and the low mood. And it's like, okay, here's an antidepressant. It's going to affect your like emotional state. But there is just zero recognition in the world of pharmacy, or at least there was zero recognition, that drugs can inherently be spiritual. And that if drugs can inherently be spiritual, then there's probably a biological construct of spirituality in their brain that they're kind of activating, right? So we could learn so much about spirituality from a scientific perspective simply by using psychedelics as like neuropharmacologic probes. So that's just one reason to make them at least researchable and make research easier, is we're going to learn stuff about consciousness, the brain, things like that. So it's like, okay, even if you just hate psychedelics and feel like they should never be part of society and treatments for mental illness and things like that, like, please just allow us to ask questions and use them as neuropharmacologic probes and research. Like, please, like, come on, like, you're really just not going to allow us to like answer legitimate questions about how our brain works, about why we feel the way we feel, about what makes us feel that way. And So it's just kind of like, to me, yeah, it's sort of like traditionally they've been there, but it's sort of like the divide is just collapsing. And in a lot of ways, it was a false distinction
Yeah.
the entire time. And I don't know. I don't know about the world. I tend to think that there's a lot of spiritual sickness out there.
Yeah.
Like it's not really talked about. How would you even diagnose it? What would be the criteria that you would use? I've never thought about it, and maybe I could think of some later, right? But so because it's just maybe a more nebulous kind of like concept of illness. But yeah, I mean, it seems like humanity has kind of psychologically detached themselves for nature. There's a real like conceptualization that it's like there's me and then there's nature out there. There's like almost a belief that the world was created for us, therefore we can do whatever we want with it. That's a spiritually sick thought in my head. Like I'm kind of like, if you're believing that, then you're literally carrying out those kinds of actions. You're thinking of yourself as some kind of specious alpha predator that belongs at the very top, and the world was just given to you to plunder and use however you would like, right? And that's ultimately probably going to bring about your own extinction, or at least, massive levels of suffering to your own kind eventually, and probably collapse, entire ecosystems at the same time. It's like, if that ain't spiritual sickness, then I don't know what is. And like, okay, well, psychedelics cure everyone and things like that. It's like, well, I don't know. It's like, it might be a stretch to just think that like they're the sole thing that's going to save the world, but at the same time, they're definitely part of it. The way that they bring people back to the connection to nature, the way that particularly psilocybin, probably other plant medicines like ayahuasca or iboga or ibogaine, really enhance this like nature related connection. It really sort of like gets you out of the sort of, I would say, consumer driven perspective, where it's sort of like, okay, it's sort of like material, make me happy, material. And it's like, well, none of that stuff is ever actually going to make you happy. And actually, like, most people sort of even know that, right? But they're still just kind of going on with that sort of like pathway. So yeah, there's a lot of spiritual sickness out there. And, to me, sort of the biggest ones are, some of those like beliefs or thoughts, like why aren't we conceiving of humanity as the ecological stewards of the planet? Why wouldn't that just be like the baseline perspective? And I have the right to live and breathe just like a jellyfish has the right to live. And I don't know if it breathes, it's just kind of a blob with a non-centralized nervous system. But just that, I mean, that's fascinating. It's like a brain without a brain. It's like a anyway. So I don't know if anyone's ever read the book out here, any of your listeners to the audience, but one book that changed my life when I was 16 years old is Ishmael by David Quinn. Amazing philosophical book about kind of the story of humanity, some of these beliefs that I'm talking about, where some of the beliefs would have came from. And essentially it's about a philosopher that has a conversation with a gorilla. The gorilla is essentially the Buddha, like the mentor, like the wise one, the teacher. And basically the gorilla, through conversation, just points out all of the flaws of humanity and how we could change it, we could fix it, or exactly like what the errors in thinking are. And I think that those errors in thinking essentially are a kind of thought disease or spiritual sickness that too many of us are afflicted with.
Yeah, it seems like we've been inflicted with this idea of scarcity. And when you live a life of scarcity, you're always fighting and willing to sacrifice other people so you can have a tiny bit more. But I see so many positive signs, like just in your title alone, like spirit pharmacist. Like maybe I'm forever the optimist, or maybe I am someone who sees myself as coming out of this world instead of into this world. But I really am beginning to see the marriage of spirituality and science. And when you just think about the word whole, is like holy, to make whole. And we think about the difference between healing and curing. And I speak to so many people like yourself and other people that I've been interviewing that have a very similar idea of who they want to be. and they've made a decision to move forward in their life doing things that they love to do that help other people. And I think that the same way that there's been a void of spirituality, like there's this new rising tide of awareness of people that see themselves as part of the ecosystem instead of at odds with the ecosystem. I wanted to touch one more time though on this, since we're talking about books and disassociatives. I've spoken to some people who look at the world of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and they're like, oh, maybe they're using soma. Maybe they're using these drugs to disassociate so they can get back to their life. And I know that there's kind of been a light on there, and you addressed it a little bit, but do you think that there are some potential pitfalls for people using psychedelics, in a negative way towards people, instead of this way that we're talking about that helps people? Is there a chance for people to harness psychedelics as an abusive way to maybe get in people's heads?
Absolutely. Like, absolutely.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, like, absolutely. Like, I mean, I don't know, Michael Pollan, right?
Yeah, there you
Good
go.
guy. He pollinated the people's minds about psychedelics with his book, How to Change Your Mind, and his documentary, How to Change Your Mind, right? So psychedelics are about changing your mind, right? But it's like, in which direction are we changing, and in what way are we changing it? So a lot of it, again, comes down to controlling the environment that they're ingested in, getting the right intentions straight, and ingesting them with people that have our best interest at heart and are trying to mold us towards the person that we want to be rather than the person that they want us to be. So because psychedelics, like, all of them really cause these non-ordinary states, and in the non-ordinary state, you are emotionally open, vulnerable, suggestible, right? So I would say that psychedelics attract wounded people that want healing. They attract healers, earnest people that do beautiful, incredible work. They attract sociopaths, narcissists, and manipulators, because it, like moths to a flame, it's like the perfect tool to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish if you are that kind of person. So yeah, it's the Wild West right now in psychedelic guiding, sort of like industry. The word's out, the clinical trials are so positive. You have all of these people trying to jump on a wagon and be a psychedelic guide. But yeah, you're coming to this looking for healing. Buyer beware, like eyes wide open. You need to be thinking, how long has the person been doing this? Do they have a background in mental health or the issues that I'm coming to deal with? Have they dealt with clients like me before? There's a lot of other kinds of like questions that you could ask. What's my gut feeling about this person? If it's not an F yes, then if there's some level of reservation, you can't even put your finger on it, pass would be sort of like my suggestion overall. So that's just it, is like, I don't know, like hypnosis, for example. It's like putting someone in a trance is essentially, when you're in trance, you're more suggestible than normal. And usually you put somebody in trance by giving them a bunch of truisms in a row, things that they can't really like argue with, because the subconscious just says yes, 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 yes. And you could quit smoking. Yes. Right. So I think that there's a way with psychedelics to use them almost as trance or hypnotic inducing agents, give the person their, subjective experience, which probably should be mostly theirs. There probably shouldn't be much interference and whatever. It should just be sort of like, I'm emotionally supporting whatever they need during that time. But maybe on the back end, or things are wearing off, man, they're still so open, vulnerable, suggestible. They're in a neuroplastic window. If you can do some guided somatic releasing kinds of meditations, or if you can put persons on that have just really wonderful language that sort of leads people down this rabbit hole of releasing what they no longer need, or stepping into their highest power, or practicing forgiveness, acceptance, being the witness, like whatever they want to work on, right? There's guided meditations for all of these things. And on the flip side, really avoid suggesting things that you haven't talked about ahead of time with a person during the experience. It's sort of like, okay, if you're thinking about adding ketamine at some point. That should be a contingency plan that is extremely clear and well discussed ahead of time, and the circumstances for what, where, and when it's going to be done. It shouldn't be that somebody's on MDMA or LSD or something, and it's like, hey, things are going pretty well. Want a K shot? Right? It's sort of like, it's like, it's comical. It's like, it's laughable, but this is happening. Like, this is happening. People are doing this kind of stuff, right? There are people out there that they get contacted of a psychedelic guide and whatnot, and there is no, well, who are you and what are you bringing to the table and this and that. There's next Saturday's open. Want to come over? It's just sort of, yeah, it's just really fast, like just rushing into something that's going to put you in this position where you're at the mercy of your environment. So controlling it, making a safe environment is absolutely paramount, but then almost at the mercy of the suggestion of the persons that you're going to be around or be with, right? So make sure they're not kooky folks that are going to start spouting off weird religious dogma in the middle or something like that. Like, it could happen.
It's interesting to take the sacrament out of the setting. You know, it seems that in a ritualistic setting, there are elders, there's people that have been around the sacrament, there's people that have been around the medicine that understand the ceremony. And then when you take the medicine out of the ceremony, you kind of take away all the regulations from it. And you could see how that could be problems. It could allow for that particular.
Well, yes and no. I mean, in some ways, like, it's kind of like, yeah, there's like just because someone's holding a ceremony or a ritual, I wouldn't necessarily take that to mean that they're doing it right, or that the setting is good, or that they're not nefarious or up to some sort of like manipulative thing. Because in some ways, like putting a ceremony around it, putting a ritual around it, it just like almost makes it stronger as far as like the ability to, right? Because it's kind of like, okay, you're coming into my ceremony and my space, and these are the rules for my ceremony, and I'm the healer, you're the person that needs healed, right? So there's a power dynamic,
right?
And oh yeah, you know what? Like, I bet my penis could heal your sexual trauma.
Guaranteed, it's magic.
I mean, this happens in like ayahuasca circles.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's even happened in psychedelic assisted therapy sorts of like settings.
Wow.
Right. So yeah, like, again, like how to change your mind. Psychedelics can do that. Some of the most beautiful, earnest, wonderful, talented healers in the world out there are using psychedelics as the tools, in my opinion. But eyes wide open, buyer beware. There's a lot of people that are attracted to this space, and not all of them have everyone's best interests at heart. And even some people have best interests at heart, but they're just unskilled at what they do and haven't been doing it long enough and don't have any experience in the kind of issues that people are facing. So are probably just kind of, not cause a lot of harm, but just kind of like botch it in some way.
Yeah, in some ways it proposes so much opportunity for healing, but in other ways it just proposes the same temptation that comes with any sort of great power. You know, and in a way it is a power.
Exactly. With great power comes great responsibilities. Psychedelics are a double-edged sword.
Yeah, we should write that down. That's pretty good. I like that. You know, as a pharmacologist, is it common? This is like a two-part question. And is it common to give a course of drugs? Like maybe you would go antibiotics and then something else, or maybe you would take like this drug and then that drug. And if that's true, might it be possible in the future to offer a course of psychedelics that could help particular types of traumas? Like you could go with MDMA followed by a course of psilocybin. What do you think?
Yeah. Now we're getting somewhere.
Getting somewhere.
Yeah. Well, so far the psychedelic assisted therapy, it's been, mono drug, like maybe one session, but probably more commonly for major depression or PTSD, like 2 or 3 sessions spaced about a month apart, but all psilocybin or all MDMA. It's pretty common out there that psychedelic guides or therapists may be working with more than one substance, either in a sequence or in combination at the same time on the same day. There's no data around that. Particularly things like, well, my goodness, as far as like opening a space that is one of the most beautiful and potential for healing kind of spaces and things like that. Like MDMA and ketamine, it's an incredible combination. But yeah, got some reservations about the cardiovascular risks there, because both drugs have warnings on them for increases in blood pressures and heart rates and things like that. So I do believe that combinations and or sequences of psychedelics have an important role to play in the kind of like future of psychedelic therapy. Right. And even contemporarily, right? People are doing this kind of stuff. Yeah. It's just not evidence-based or really data-driven. Again, like people ask me all the time, like, I did psychedelic X. When can I do psychedelic Y? Right. And okay, maybe if it's ayahuasca or ibogaine, there really is some time frame that you should wait for a safety purpose, but it's still probably not a long time frame. We're talking like, days, not weeks or months and that kind of thing. Some psychedelic retreats offer more than one psychedelic sacrament or medicine, or maybe offer a couple with some sort of complementary shamanic modalities and things of that nature. So it's already done fairly regularly. And basically, I'm kind of thinking like, yeah, well, is this the kind of retreat or psychedelic weekends where it's been set up to like, this is my Tough Mudder psychedelic gauntlet that everyone's going to go through and come out with like rubber stamp guaranteed mystical experience and your egg got cracked type of thing? Or is it the sort of like, hey, yeah, we start with this on the first day. This is an option for the second day. Third day is usually rest. We have this shamanic modality you could try in the afternoon if you wanted. But, no matter what, like every experience is optional. And even if you want to do the experience, just like we're going to talk with you a little bit about kind of how are you feeling today, where you're at, whether you're looking for a deep experience today, whether you want something kind of lighter, whether you're sort of still feeling like you're processing from last night, and we could maybe spend a little bit of time just like talking it through without going on that other journey, right? If it's like really the kind of sequence where it's mindful and you're evaluating and meeting a person where they're at before offering something else. And like I said before, the plans, like why we're doing it, when we're doing it, all the kind of contingency thing has been laid out for the person in the kind of like preparation phase, then there's probably a lot of good that could come from those kinds of things. But yeah, the sort of like just stack. I don't know. It's like, well, this is going to make you better. Like kind of, it's just too much. And that's exactly where people kind of bite off more than they can chew and emerge, quite anxious or dysphoric in some kind of way. And it takes a while, it's like Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall. It takes all the king's horses and all the king's men a little bit of time to put Humpty back together again. And so, you want to kind of pick a bite-sized piece with an intention, break it off, get the gold, figure it out, integrate it, make it your new habitual state. You can try something else. I don't have any, like I've never seen an experiment that looks at the sort of like neuroplastic potential of a combination, right? But I mean, I'd bet $1,000 that you get more neuroplasticity mixing ketamine with psilocybin than either drug alone. Like,
yeah,
I even give you 2 to 1.
I'm gonna have to come down. We have to do this experiment. We have to figure it out.
Well, hopefully, like Olson's lab at UC Davis is doing a lot of like really wonderful science on like neuroplasticity and things like that. They actually just published this article looking at a potentially novel mechanism for psychedelics. Basically, they found that binding to serotonin 2A receptors on the postsynaptic membrane of the neuron was not enough to produce a psychedelic effect. And in fact, the psychedelic had to bind to an intracellular population of receptors, which is pretty, makes your head scratch. It's sort of like, man, what are those receptors like doing on the inside of the cell? And, they're kind of, in their discussion, they're kind of like, well, I mean, serotonin doesn't really seem like it seems too polar, so it can't dissolve through the cell membrane to reach the intracellular space and bind to that receptor. But what can dissolve through the membranes and bind to the receptor is psilocin and NN-DMT. but not bufotenine, the metabolite of 5-MeO-DMT, which doesn't seem to be very psychedelic at all. So it almost like their conclusion is like, wow, cortical dendritogenesis, or some of the neuroplasticity of psychedelics, probably results from intracellular activation of these serotonin 2A receptors. But if you're just listening, you can't see my air quotes on serotonin 2A receptors right now, but I'm putting in quotation marks because they sort of conclude like those might not be serotonin receptors. They might just be DMT receptors. Like they may just be receptors for endogenous DMT. So amazing science, like just the fact that they have the tools and methods to be able to run experiments to get that granular is absolutely incredible. But then you read the paper's conclusion and it's like, endogenous and exogenous psychedelics need to be studied in human health and disease, period.
Wow.
So it's like wow. And this is Science 2023. First author's Vargas, if you want to go check out that article. But yeah, it's just so like I'm almost crying just talking about it, but it's sort of like I was like crying reading it because I was just sort of like, wow, here they are with the coolest granular level of inquiry that leads to an amazing conclusion about a novel mechanism of psychedelics stimulating intracellular serotonin receptors. But then their conclusion is just the most massive scoping statement.
Yeah. It's just, it's a whole new world to investigate. Like it just shows you how little we know so much, but how much more is there? How much further is there to go? There's a group of guys, Yahim Fieber. He's got a company called April 19th, and they're studying, like, he wrote a paper called The Next Generation of Psychedelics. And he couldn't tell me exactly what they're doing because he has like these NDAs or whatever, but he's talking about the way in which there's an alternate receptor. And I don't know if it's intracellular or something like that, but that's being attached to it. It blows my mind to even think about, but it's so fascinating to think about what could be on the horizon for medicine, what could be on the horizon for psychedelics, and what these things can actually do. We might just be knocking on the door right now trying to get in. It's fascinating to think about.
Yeah.
What it was.
Well, I think again, it's like it just comes full circle.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of like, if you really think about it, it's sort of like, well, what was the first form of sort of like mental health care out there? It was shamanism, right? And sometimes the shaman used the sacrament and sometimes not, right? And then after that, we entered the, I don't know, well, psychiatry was born in the 1800s. So it's like basically a brand new medical specialty. It came along kind of after some of the others, but the sort of like the first big kind of push in psychiatry was psychoanalysis. So, Carl Jung or like Freud kind of thinking that psychoanalyzing somebody, or essentially going into their subconscious and sort of finding out what the repressed thoughts, desires, and things like that were sort of like the keys to unlocking mental illness and allowing for healing. And then, we discovered like elemental lithium for mania or bipolar disorder, or chlorpromazine or like thorazine for psychosis. And that ushered in the biological age of psychiatry, because for the first time ever, you had persons with bipolar conditions or psychotic conditions that were quite severe, and they could take a drug and feel better, and they could live in the community. They didn't have to live in an insane asylum. Like this is the asylum era, right? Still in the like 50s, right? Like not too long ago. So lithium and thorazine kind of brought around the end of the asylum era, and then you had this sort of like massive genesis of psychotropic drugs over the last 50 years or so. And it's, very much been focused on this sort of biological paradigm of psychiatry, or daily medication taking as the way to like manage or treat mental illnesses. So I'm really excited about psychedelic assisted therapy because, hooray, finally we have a modality that acknowledges and kind of marries both of these things together, in that you have a drug that enhances some kind of psychological processing, and then you have the psychological processing around it to keep things safe, make it more efficacious, things like that. And in a lot of ways, psychedelic assisted therapy is neo-shamanism. I mean,
I've never heard that term before.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally like exactly like the Western therapist stamped model of shamanism is psychedelic assisted therapy. And probably some people that will disagree with me on that kind of like statement overall, but there's some truth there.
Yeah, I think that there should be more. I had an experience once where I took a really high dose of psilocybin, and I started believing all these crazy things, like to the point where I knew them to be true. But then when I came down and I processed a little bit, I was like, that must be exactly what it's like for someone in a psychotic break. Like they believe these things wholeheartedly, the same way that I believe these things. And I'm like, I think that there's real insight there. Like, because you could think about yourself in that position. You could have real empathy for someone who's having a break, and you've went through it. And I think that that was part of the shamanistic tradition, or even some of the early work with psychedelics, were the people taking them and being like, okay, I get it, what it's like to be in that state. Now I can try to figure out some remedies for that. Is that sound accurate?
I don't know. I don't know. Like I do think, for example, particularly if you've had a moment on psychedelics that things have not been going well and you've been sort of like overwhelmed with paranoia or something of that nature, I think that it gives you an ability to empathize with a person with psychosis, whether it's really like having psychosis or not. Maybe not. Like there's probably aspects of it that are quite similar, and perhaps aspects of it that are less consistent. But I think to your point, yeah, it's kind of fair to sort of think like, well, I mean, why do psychedelic experiences go well and heal people? Because we control the set and setting. What would it be like to be on 250 micrograms of LSD, walking around trying to live your life and have to do that for a month straight? It's like, would it go well? Would you feel good? So I think from that angle, like it allows you to sort of like have a lot of empathy. It's like if your reality testing was impaired, right? That kind of like I was having these, in your words, like kind of crazy thoughts that I like started believing, right? Like if your sort of reality testing was impaired almost permanently, it would be really hard. It would be really hard to sort out truth. It would be really hard to just live on an even keel as far as mood goes. You walk into the grocery store, the fluorescent lighting, and you could wig out, And anyone that's been to a grocery store on LSD probably has even more empathy. Yeah.
Dr. Ben, I'm getting close on time. I'm super thankful that we got to hang out today, and I love it. It was really fun. I think that everybody who is working with a retreat or something like that should probably have your number on speed dial, or at least have your site right there for to look at. Let's say that you're one of my listeners, or you're somebody that's interested in what you're doing. Like, what's the best way to get a hold of you if they want to figure out more information, or they want to find out what you do? Like, what's the best way to do that?
My website, spiritpharmacist.com, is the absolute like best way to learn more about my like service offerings and things like that. Again, while I said I only do two things, psychopharmacology consulting and psychedelic education, that's true, right? Like you can consult with me on a one-on-one basis. You can purchase my courses like a la carte, and they're yours forever as long as Spirit Pharmacist exists. But I actually do a third thing, which combines the consulting and the education. So I have a member resource and support program. It's a subscription. And this is my vehicle for people that want to work longitudinally with me. So you're listening, you're a facilitator, you're a provider, you're a retreat organization, or maybe you're just an individual on a healing journey, and you're going to need to taper a couple of psychiatric meds, or suspect you may need to, and begin using psychedelics. And you just want someone to sort of touch base with, or visit with, or bounce questions off as you go. The member resource and support program is the best way to do that. Like it suggests, it's a resource and support program. So it includes all of the classes that I've done, all the webinars I've given, all the written drug information guides that I've constructed. So instead of like buying a course a la carte, we just get one. It's more like you're renting my Netflix library of courses, webinars, information guides, things like that. And then as far as the support services, there's a drug information service, or like an email-based Q&A. Also respond via encrypted apps, via voice messages like Signal or WhatsApp. I'll sometimes leave a message. Sometimes it's just much more efficient to communicate or kind of go back and forth asynchronously like that. And then you get discounted rates on kind of one-to-one consulting. So a lot of persons that are having sort of, I would say, like a longitudinal relationship with me are kind of getting clients perhaps that are taking psychiatric medications, and they seem like a good fit, the rapport is there, things like that, but they just have some sort of outstanding questions, or want to like kind of optimally understand like what the interaction potential is and what that person may need to do to have an ideal experience for them. And in that case, it's sort of like, okay, well, we can sort some of it out through email Q&A, but some of this comes down to, does the drug work for you? Do you like it? Is there side effects? Do you have an intention of stopping it? Like things like that. And it's like, well, I can't tell that from an intake form. We need to have a conversation with the person. So at that point, they can book a discounted consultation. So the Member Resources Support Program, if you want to take a course, you want to book a consult, you want to ask questions on an ongoing basis, quickly becomes like the best value to do it. And like, I don't even have an email Q&A service outside the member program. So speed dial, I mean, I tend to think that, you know, if you're doing your screening properly, you're doing your preparation properly, there's probably little in the world of psychedelic therapy that really should be urgent or emergent. I try to respond to email questions as quickly as I can, but like, frankly, for efficiency, I usually batch them a couple times a week, maybe 3 times a week. So people are usually looking at a few business days to get a response. Sometimes it's a little quicker than that. Sometimes it could be up to 5 business days, but you know, I respond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, on a related side note, what advice would you give to people? Like here in Hawaii, we have something called the Clarity Project, and we're working with the legislation to try and get them to understand the benefits of psychedelic therapy. I know that they have different legalities in Colorado and Oregon, and that they've worked with their legislature. What advice, if any, would you give to people who are trying to give the legislature, their government, notice about why psychedelics are good? Is there anything in particular that you would highlight that the people tell or ask the legislature to review? You know, is it maybe we could bring down healthcare cost, or maybe this is something that's best for wellness, or is there any particular angle that you think might be advantageous?
Well, I'd probably take a different angle depending on like what I was trying to do, right? Like if I was trying to decriminalize psilocybin, I'd probably take a slightly different angle than if I was trying to medicalize MDMA, for example. Like probably a pretty different angle, like overall, really. You know, I think that, you know, you can like rah, psychedelics are so great, psychedelics are healing, this and that, but it's sort of like the elephant in the room. I think for most persons that aren't in the world of psychedelics, there's like, are these things safe? Do they hurt people? Aren't people just going to be, you know, jumping out of windows and crashing cars and all this kind of stuff? Or maybe just they need education around what decriminalization even is. A lot of people have decriminalization and legalization just kind of, well, I mean, it's I guess it's a form of law change. It's a form of regulation, but it's not really legalization. It's more like taking it away as far as a priority for law enforcement. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to sell large quantities and open up a shop and things like that. So depending on what it is, you might sort of focus on different things, but I tend to focus on like where are the reservations that people would have? They're probably not reserved around like, I mean, maybe there's some people that have reservations. It's like, does that really treat depression? And it's like, well, I don't know. You could read the New England Journal of Medicine and conclude yes, if you really want to, right? But I think more like the bigger reservations are just around sort of like, is that safe for an adult to use? And isn't that going to make the rates of psychosis and bipolar disorders go through the roof? And, you know, isn't that going to be a stress on our local hospital systems when everyone goes bananas and has to go there? And, you know, it's probably a lot about reassuring that no, psychedelics aren't addictive actually, right? At least not psilocybin. If you're talking about MDMA and ketamine, yeah, they're on a substance dependence habituation spectrum somewhere, but they're still not at high risk compared to other sanctioned things like alcohol or cigarettes. So yeah, just I don't know if I have any like one thing, but I would sort of just think like, I guess my one thing is it depends. And
it's funny.
and probably just like thinking about like, what am I trying to do? And what are going to be the biggest like roadblocks, reservations, or like hesitations of my audience for just saying like, yeah, that's okay. And like focusing on like safety, right? It's almost like if I'm talking to the public, I mean, most of the time I'm probably actually trying to temper their expectations around efficacy and get them not to be thinking of it as like a mystical bullet and more like a path that they're on and a process that they're going through that could require a few administrations. And it's a course that you're going through, not a one and done, boof, oh, goodbye, depression, PTSD type of experience. And then I would say if I'm talking to more like the healthcare provider, the legislature, like something like that, it's much more, around like trying to reassure them that it's safe and that you could set up some kind of system or way that would allow people to access it responsibly and not hurt themselves. And because that's probably what the policymaker is, concerned about. I don't know, depends who the policymaker is too. Yeah. Like, I think, depending on what side of the aisle and things like that, maybe you would include some surveys of their constituents and what their constituents actually want. Because I think for a long time, we've sort of thought of psychedelics as a partisan sort of issue, but I feel like the polls or surveys that I've heard of or seen recently suggest that it's much more bipartisan these days than it's ever been in the past. JAMA, they just published a legislative analysis a month or two ago predicting not if, but when psychedelics are going to be legalized. And I forget their answer was like somewhere between like 2035 to 2038 or something like that. So it's like, here's the Journal of the American Medical Association predicting when psychedelics will be legalized. So I think that to me, I was kind of like, man, the biggest medical journal in all the land is basically saying the train's left the station. This is coming down the pike. This is happening. It's not a question of how our law or if our laws will change, but like in what way will they change and things like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Such an awesome time. Dr. Ben, is there anything else that you want to leave us with, or did we cover everything, or anything else you want to tell everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I say like, I don't know. I try and include like something for everyone, right? So spiritpharmacist.com is my site. You could follow me on Instagram or Facebook. I do post on LinkedIn, not quite as often. I have some, free guides for download looking at antidepressant and psychedelic interactions, psilocybin like dose testing in combination with an antidepressant, like a drug interaction and pharmacology guide on 5-MeO DMT. I got Breakthrough Psychedelics. It's a guide that compares the pharmacology of MDMA, psilocybin, and ketamine. Got a blog, right? So it's like, I don't know, I kind of talked a little bit about like the courses and the consulting and the member program. And those are essentially all my like paid offers. Right. But I really try to put free education out there as well, because I mean, exactly, like if we're expecting the psychedelic renaissance to go well, it seems like before you had a psychedelic renaissance, you would have a renaissance in psychedelic education. Yeah. Or at the very least, it should be happening at the same time, because I think that if you let the cat out of the bag again, but don't tell anyone what it is or how to use it, then you're probably going to see preventable harm. And that's the last thing that we want. Yeah, I think signing up on correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you go to the Spirit Pharmacist and you put in your email address, then there's kind of a newsletter. I've gotten so many great like not surveys, but great links to papers that I've written. I'm like, whoa, look at this one. And I'm not sure if we covered that, but people who are listening, you should check it out. You could. Yeah. The recent one was pretty awesome. Yeah. Well, I do a monthly email, so I have some. I don't know, they're automated searches that are done in PubMed or Medline. It's like a literature database. And then I get the results in my inbox, and then I comb through the abstracts until I find somewhere between 6 or 7 that I really like, that I think are worth telling people about. And then I send a newsletter. So sign up to my email list. Yeah. There's some value coming your way there too. Yeah, a lot of value for people, my listeners, and I think people that are interested about psychedelics. It's really nice to have a guide on all kinds of levels, whether you're someone who's learning about psychedelics
by taking them, someone who is reading about them. But that's what the newsletter is like. I'm excited because I'm like, oh, there's gonna be like 5 or 7 new things in here. Maybe I can get a guest. Maybe I can learn about this. But it's really well done, and I can tell by reading those and talking to you how passionate you are about the world we live in and how excited you are. And like I said, I think you're a pioneer in a lot of ways, bringing together the world of spirit and medicine, and it's a beautiful thing. I'm really thankful for it. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure being part of the True Life podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. The links will be in the show notes. Check out Ben, sign up to the email, look through his website. If it's right for you, don't hesitate to sign up and reach out to him. And Ben, hang on for a second. I'm going to close this out. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for everything. Hope you have a fantastic day. Aloha.